Welcome to Baker Briefing. I am Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico, and the guest host for today's episode. Our center just released its annual Mexico Country Outlook report, in which we explore issues for Mexico and the U.S. Mexico relationship in the year ahead. One of those issues is water sharing. The 1944 Water Treaty has underpinned binational cooperation over the shared waters of the Rio Grande and the Colorado River for over 80 years. But now, climate change, prolonged drought, and increasing water demands are testing the resilience of that treaty, with major challenges facing border communities, farmers, and supply chains on both sides of the border. To discuss the issue in more depth, we welcomed Rosario Sanchez, a senior research scientist at the Texas Water Resources Institute, which is the designated water research institute for the state of Texas and part of Texas A&M University, to the podcast. With Ivonne Cruz, a research scholar at the Baker Institute, we talked about our history of transboundary water management and policy paths forward for dealing with the challenges of today. Thanks for tuning in. Well, thank you for joining us, Rosario, Ivonne. It's really a pleasure to speak with you. The U.S. and Mexico share the bodies of water that straddle the border, whether it's underground or above ground. And this is, by the way, not a unique situation. There are many other countries that do. Turkey and Iraq and China and Vietnam and countries in Africa and everywhere else. So this is not unique. And of course, any two countries that are neighboring always had to figure out how to share that water, the vital life-producing element that we all need. And they have to achieve certain legal arrangements to figure out how to share that resource. Lead us in a couple of minutes through the history of how Mexico and the United States have dealt with it. Give us a little bit of the background history of how the two countries have dealt with having to share those resources that straddle the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly after 1848, when the current border was pretty much set.
Thank you, Tony, very much for the invitation, Yvonne, as well, for having me today. And of course, for me, it's a long history of relationships, not just water. And it all started with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the war between Mexico and the United States, and the delineation of the border itself. So there were different circumstances, different fights, different wars, even the Texas-Mexico War and then the U.S. War, that defined the limits. There was a process. It was not intentional, but at the end of the day, at the end of the discussions and negotiations between the two countries, where the limits should have been, it made sense to have the rivers delineate because there were natural barriers to the countries. It applies particularly true for the Rio Grande, which covers 60% of the border between the two countries. So after the delineation of where the borders should be, there were a couple of disputes across the long border that we have. And when I say Mexico, U.S., they needed a certain committee that would deal with these issues of the unresolved delineation of the border. And those are the origins of the current International Boundary Water Commission. So it was designed to deal with border issues at the beginning, but later on, and actually it was more like a temporary pilot binational commission to delineate, to set the differences between the two countries and agree on where the limit should be. After that, the IBWs was so successful in terms of cooperation and collaboration that they decided after the 1944 Water Treaty, which is the treaty that now regulates water between the two countries, to become a more permanent commission, which is now the IBWC, that deals only not with infrastructure, not only with border issues, with limits issues, but also with water issues, which now has become the most important issue that the Commission has to deal with. But more into the technical expertise more into the implementation of the treaty, more into the operation of the treaty, not necessarily on the legal framework of the treaty. So the water treaty after 1944, it was preceded by the 1906 convention, of course, which is regulates the upper part of the Rio Grande. And the first years of the IBWC operating as IBWC, but there were other historical and cultural events taking place, diplomatic events taking place, and that was a separate treaty that still governs the upper part of the Rio Grande Basin. Then in 1944, which was 30 years later or so, where the lower part of the Rio Grande and the Colorado River Basin were agreed on how to distribute shared water systems, surface water systems, not groundwater systems.
Why?
Until to keep
That seems to me like a rather interesting omission. Why only surface water, which we know comes from the mountains up in Colorado and, sort of comes from the interior part of the United States, and then it becomes the river, becomes the border, both the Colorado River shed and then the Rio Grande River shed, the two most important ones. There's also a smaller one, the Tijuana River, which also crosses the border. But why the omission? Why not think about the underground water deposits? Why just the surface?
Well, there was some kind of political momentum, urgency, especially on the Texas side, for what's becoming the lower part of the Rio Grande, and also on the Mexico side for the Rio Colorado Basin, when the infrastructure, the big dam, the Hoover Dam, starting its construction. And when Mexico started to depend more in the agricultural sector from deliveries from the Colorado River, and being at the end of the line, Mexico, it was in a certain hurry to sign something related to surface water, because back then, the most water used in the systems on both sides, it was just surface water. It wasn't really the demand for groundwater at that point. However, in 1973, there is the only minute that was signed between the two countries recognizing the need to cover by both countries groundwater. Nothing has happened after 1973. And that was the minute 242 that took care of the salinity issues of the lower Colorado River on the Yuma aquifer. But it's the only aquifer across the complete border that is regulated by both countries.
For the benefit of our listeners, what we're talking about here is the fact that underground water at that time was not needed, and the minutes are essentially a mechanism within these organizations, the IVWC, International Boundary and Water Commission in the United States, and the equivalent, I guess, the SILA, Mexican organization, and they work together. And so when they meet to sort of interpret the 1944 treaty for water sharing, that's how they make small operational modifications to the treaty. So you're talking about the minute from that year, but they continuously pass these minutes to sort of try to update a treaty that's old, 1944, and it's got glaring omissions like the underground water. And obviously, it's no longer a treaty that is adequate to today's conditions. And so the only way for SILA IDWC to do it is by passing these minutes, right?
Yes, and thank you for noticing that, Tony. It's important. It's very important to mention that under international water law, there is no other instrument, other treaty out there that contains this element of adaptation, how to adapt a legal instrument. So the minute process is an built-in process that helps the treaty to evolve to new conditions, new needs. Because after they are signed by the two commissioners from both countries, they become law. They become part of the treaty with the same legal, I guess, jurisdiction for both countries, which is very unique. It has been said the 1944 treaty between the two countries has been looked at by different regions of the world as an example to follow on how this was actually so visionary in 1944. There were no easy times, not for the US, not for Mexico, not for the world, actually. But the vision that those diplomats had back there, it's worth mentioning. So now the minute process, I mean, we have so far 332 minutes since 1944. So it's not a virgin treaty. And I usually criticize people that kind of get scared when we say we should revised the 1944 treaty. And some people say, no, 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 let's not touch the treaty. Let's not touch the treaty. I say, well, the treaty has been amended 332 times already. Any new amendment, any new change of the treaty, we don't need a new treaty. We just need a new minute. That has been happening more often since scarcity has been kind of the ordinary condition among the two countries.
And I ask
So,
a question,
yeah.
Rosario, because clearly this is a really good point that we don't need a new treaty in 1944. It's an 80-year-old treaty. That's fine. It's still functioning. It works. But even with the minutes, this interesting mechanism to sort of update the treaty and over 300 modifications to the treaty, which are part of the treaty already. When you change the treaty or modify it or reinterpret it by a minute, this particular document agreed to by both parties, I think that gives the treaty flexibility. But is it a mechanism that is fast enough to adjust to current conditions? Clearly, the question is whether the transboundary agreement, with all the flexibility that the minutes, this mechanism introduces to them, is still adequate to address the urgent need to be considerably more judicious about water sharing. What are the challenges today that you think open a gap between the treaty itself, the way it works, the way water is distributed, and the reality of a much drier climate change, the increasing demand, because both Texas and the northern states of Mexico are growing very fast. The population is growing. So tell us a little bit about that, the urgent need now and going into the future to perhaps be alert to the kinds of changes that the treaty may need from now on, even if it is through the minutes.
It doesn't set any limits. It's unlimited what you can do in the minute process. The limits are imposed by the countries, not the treaty, not the minute process. So if we are not seeing enough changes into the treaty, it's not because of the treaty. It's because the countries have not agreed on what to do next. Because they can agree on absolutely anything and put it in a minute and it becomes law. The problem here is not the treaty, it's the reality that we're facing, the complexity of the issues that we're facing, the priorities that we are establishing. The current political agenda is very, very hard. It's extremely uncertain and it's extremely political. Everything is political at this point. And it's hard. I think it's unfair to put the pressure on the treaty when the reality is the negotiation process across the two countries. So it has worked for the Colorado River Basin. I mean, they agree on reductions of allocations among the 7 states in the U.S. and Mexico. Mexico has agreed to reduce its own allocations to 20% so far since 2017. That was meaning 217, 223, and recently 330. And honestly, next year when they would sign the new minute, more reductions are going to coming to the table for all of them. So it is possible. Those 323 and 330, those minutes, if you read through them, they even have ecological flows there, the pools flow, which are now in danger. Could be because it needs to be renewed, and we don't know if the political agenda or the political environment will allow for that renewal. But the extent to which those minutes were able to accomplish at binational level on that basin are extraordinary. Of course, they're not perfect, but they're huge steps towards where we need to go in terms of more sustainable water governance regimes.
Then let me ask you, because you mentioned that on the western side, the Colorado River share, Mexico and I think 7 states that share that watershed, the Colorado River coming down, have agreed to reduce water sharing to adjust to the physical conditions, to the reality conditions on the ground. So they've responded through the treaty, but they've responded to a changing reality. What has not happened on this side, the eastern side, Texas, Mexico, that we haven't adjusted? Why haven't we committed to reductions in water use or water allocation or restrictions on water? What is different on the west that is not happening on the east?
Okay, there are many, many differences. First, the treaty itself. The treaty itself do not stipulate reductions on allocations on the lower Rio Grande Basin. It stipulates flexibility of allocations from Mexico to the U.S. on a 5-year term, and the possibility of Mexico to get in deficit if it's not able to accommodate water under the 5-year term. It doesn't talk about reductions. It gives Mexico an extraordinary flexibility. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that Mexico and the U.S. could not agree on reductions on the Rio Grande Basin through a minute process, which is usually missed. However, the problem here arises that 77% of the basin relies on the Mexican side. So what Mexico has done over the last, let's say, since early 90s, is relying on this extraordinary drought provision that allows Mexico to get in deficit. I believe this extraordinary drought provision has been abused. That flexibility, now it's a luxury that the U.S. is not able to tolerate anymore. When I say U.S., I mean Texas, because they own the water rights. So it has become a luxury. And the pressure on Mexico right now is because of that, because Mexico still's allowed to get in deficit technically by the treaty. So what needs to happen to be in a similar, with these different conditions, to the Colorado River Basin, which allows for reductions, annual reductions for all riparians. It is written there. It doesn't allow for deficit. It doesn't allow for 5-year allocation process. It's a yearly allocation, but allows for deductions when there's extraordinary drought. On the Rio Grande is not a year allocation, and it allows for 5-year cycles and actually getting deficit. So it's a problem of we need to adjust that part of the treaty that is not working. Why? Because the amount of water that Mexico is supposed to provide to the U.S. doesn't even exist in the system anymore. Mexico has not done its work on the terms of governance system that allows Mexico to manage water in a more efficient way to comply with the treaty. And we have seen that over the last 25 years, where Mexico waits for the last day of the last year to come up with some minutes.
Yeah, this is a really important point because here we are recording this podcast on October 23rd. The clock has to be reset, or the balance has to be brought down to zero again, unless extraordinary conditions appear and Mexico appeals to them not to deliver its share of the water. But this is the end of the quinquennial. In a day or two, the 5-year balance to zero period has to come to a close. And where is Mexico today in its delivery a day before the quinquennial expires? What are the issues facing Mexico's full delivery of its water commitment at the end of these 5 years as we record this podcast? What is the state of the delivery? What is Mexico specifically saying about its ability to deliver and bring the balance down to zero again? Or will it ask for an extension given the extraordinary conditions, drought conditions in the country?
Mexico is a day away and is halfway to it. Mexico owns around 1,000 million cubic meters of water. And we knew months before, even a year ago, that the amount of water that Mexico was supposed to allocate during this time frame was completely unfeasible, given drought conditions, given reservoir levels, given expectations. Mexico over the years has relied on hurricanes to comply with the treaty. But now with climate, we all know we cannot rely on climate. The uncertainty of climate is not our ally anymore. And it has proven that over the last 3 cycles. We are reaching the 3rd consecutive cycle, which Mexico ends in deficit. And then the day before, which would be today or probably tomorrow, I'm not sure what Mexico is going to do, but sign a minute in which it will start looking for water options on other tributaries. This was done last year, minute 325, where Mexico opened up the rest of its tributaries to the Rio Grande, to the rest of the water rights of the reservoirs to comply with the treaty. The problem with this, it shows a lot of willing. Of course, Mexico is really interested in complying. It's always saying that, and President Sheinbaum says, we don't need to revise the treaty. We will comply. We will comply. But the water is not there to comply. So I'm not sure exactly what they are negotiating instead. But minute 325 already opened up all possibilities, bringing water from El Cuchillo, bringing water for Alamo, which was 100% Mexico ownership, bringing water from Amistad, Mexico ownership water, even compromising water rights for downstream users. In this case, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas. And we all know that Tamaulipas is not willing to give up its water rights anymore. We've heard that over the last 5 years. And over the summer, the state of Coahuila and the cities from Coahuila, when water was delivered from Amistad, which was lower than 12% storage over the summer, started complaining, why are you taking the water to Texas? We don't even have water for potable use.
This poses an interesting problem, I think, because we're trying to frame the issue both historically and in reality right now. I think it poses an issue because I remember at the beginning of this quinquennial that ends in a day or two, that was 2020, the end of 2020, when Mexico was right up against the clock again. Like you said, it's been like that for the last 3 periods, 5-year periods. I remember that the Mexican government was trying to open the dams in the state of Chihuahua, and the farmers and ranchers were not happy, and there were even guns involved, and a couple of people killed among the farmers and ranchers resisting the federal government opening the dams to deliver water to Texas. So Texas farmers and ranchers are not happy. They're not getting the water. And evidently, farmers and ranchers in the 4 Mexican states that border Texas are not happy, and much less so if Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, is tomorrow going to try to scrape water as quickly as it can and deliver it within a day, which is also kind of an inefficient way of delivering it. Why do we need all the water in one day when it should be delivered in tranches that farmers and ranchers can predict for their agricultural activity and use over time? So clearly, we're facing a serious binational problem in which from El Paso all the way down to Brownsville, from Ciudad Juarez all the way down to Matamoros, we're in trouble a day away from the end of the quinquennial.
In serious, nobody's happy. That's the truth. Nobody's happy. And Mexico is showing political will, but it's not showing seriousness on how to deal with this. Texas is doing what it needs to do, of course, following what the treaty says. Mexico is holding on to that extraordinary drought provision as much as it can. And Texas is holding on to equity, reciprocity, and two words, because they don't even talk about amounts of water anymore, which is important to mention. They talk about two words, predictability and reliability, which means I need to know when and I need to know how much, which is exactly the point that you made. It's not necessarily efficient to get all that water in one day or 1 week, because we need infrastructure to be able to receive that. And when we need that integrations in the irrigation system, we need that. So I'm starting to see recognition that this is a before and after kind of a moment. Something needs to happen, because what happened in 2020 in La Boquilla was a pretty strong highlight and in a legal precedent for Mexico, because the federal government owns the water, right? It's national water. And what happened in La Boquilla was a sign that somehow, yes, Mexico, you may own the water, but you cannot take the water. Right now, social justice, human right to water, environmental equity, whatever you want to call it, but there were social values and rights involved with water rights at the same time. So that said, for me, a very important legal precedent has not been addressed by Mexico. Nothing has been done since then. And it was very important highlight. Now, on the Texas side, it's worth to mention that nothing has been done much to stop relying on the river. If we look at the numbers, the agricultural use of our water consumption from the water that comes from Mexico is only 30%. It's only 1/3. The rest comes from the Devils, from the Pecos River, that have also shown decrease on annual flows. So neither of the countries have worked towards reducing the dependence or reliance on the river for agricultural use, mostly because it's the most important use. So right now that we see that the system is crashed, that there's more water in paper than there is in the system, because we can see the water levels on every reservoir around. And if we sum them up, the math doesn't work. It's not enough for the demand. That's where groundwater now comes important. That is not contemplated in the treaty. That's where conservation becomes important. That's what additional sources of water becomes important. That's what ecological flows becomes important. And all of these subjects are not contemplated on the treaty. So yes, we need new minutes, but the extent of those minutes will be decided by the priority of the two governments.
So we have a macro challenge, climate change and less water overall. It's just a dry region. And I think people underestimate how much Texas and northern Mexico look alike in terms of the landscape, the water. That's the big challenge. At a meso level, which is kind of the middle challenges, you got the population growth and unwillingness to limit agricultural use and reduce reliance on the agricultural sector for growth. Perhaps we should not be doing agriculture in this region. I think of three sectors, right? I think of the residential sector, I think of the industrial sector, and I think agriculture, and agriculture takes most of them. So clearly that's meso level. And then at the micro level, the conflicts, the potential conflicts among different actors, they're kind of moving to use that water. So this is going to be a very difficult impasse to work. So, having laid out the issues, which are very complex, and we could spend a day talking about that, let me ask my colleague Ivonne Cruz to now go into the policy implications, some of the details of what does that mean for us who work these issues between the two countries and the
Right.
issues of water.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks, Rosario, for the just kind of getting us situated on the very complex aspect of how all these water issues, take place. And it was a perfect sort of setting the ground on how all the stakeholders that are entailed. You mentioned farmers, you mentioned the policy issues, the regulatory frameworks, and whatnot. And what Tony just mentioned about the macro, meso, and micro levels, these are so key when we're trying to solve all these problems. We can't just take it all over, but we have to address the issue, right, at a multi-level, multi-dimensional kind of way. And I wanted to ask, in your opinion, and being very knowledgeable of the case, we've had 81 years of a treaty and even more so of we've been neighbors forever. But what I'm saying of this hydro diplomacy, that we've been trying to practice ever since. And there's a collaboration. Of course, we've had good experiences in collaboration. We've had many opportunities of cooperation as well. But I think we're lacking this coordination aspect. It is so difficult because we have 3 different levels of asymmetrical institutional issues, right? Could you explain a little bit of what are these asymmetrical challenges that we face on the policy aspect? Because it'll help us understand where are areas of opportunity in this coordination effort.
You are right. Those asymmetrical challenges that you mentioned are our best opportunities right now, because those are the spaces of negotiation that we need to be focusing on. And I think states are recognizing that. So having a centralized regulatory system on Mexico's side and having each state, it's its own country when it comes to water management. States have the authority to regulate, to assign water rights, especially surface water rights. And when it comes to groundwater, that's not covered under the treaty, but that's private property. So you can imagine the scale that you have to go down, the complexity when it comes to groundwater. And that's one of the reasons why groundwater is really left let's not talk about it. It's just too much complicated to deal with that, given the current asymmetrical systems at a surface level. So when Mexico deals with the U.S. in terms of water, it has to deal with 4 different countries because each state has its own needs, its own regulatory systems, its own policies, its own methods, its own criteria, its own priorities. Mexico, it's only Mexico City is the federal government. So how do you mingle that? Now, when it comes to Texas, well, Texas has its own history with Mexico too. It has a history very different than the history that it has with California. So the trust building, the social capacity that exists, for example, between the Californias and the Sonoras and Arizonas, the region, is not the same that we have in Mexico and Texas. The relationships is pretty different. And now it's not the ideal. It's not the ideal political environment for both countries. So acknowledging that and the complexities that that means in terms of negotiation with proper stakeholders in those events when states like the state of Texas and the state of Chihuahua, which is, they have the headwaters of the Rio Conch, which provides the majority of river flow on the Rio Grande, have talked to each other and tried to arrange something at a state level, at a local level, in which we may find more spaces of coordination, of alignment of policies, of doing something more at a local level. Research has told us that when it comes to water, water is very local. When it comes to needs and priorities, it's more successful any policy that is managed and assessed at a very local scale than at a macro scale, because you're not going to be able to understand all the levels that you just spoke about. So those for me are the areas of opportunity. And yes, it's important to have the macro level. We're always going to need the macro level for validity, legitimacy, constitutionality, whatever you want to call it, and IBWC to give faith and to articulate and to support, to incentivize the coordination. But actually, the areas of opportunity relies on the states right now. The more assertive federalism in Mexico that started in 2020 is now becoming more real. Coahuila is speaking now. Tamaulipas is speaking now. And states in Mexico are not used to speak up when it comes to water, right? Because that's federal. But now that the drought has hit so much, now that things have changed so much, and they see water going somewhere else, now they are starting to speak. Now they're willing to open up and explore opportunities with this neighbor. And I've seen it personally, how Texas, how Chihuahua talk together and figure out ways to make this work for both of us.
Well, I agree. And I think we're at a good point when we see, and we were together at the NatBank Summit like a couple months ago, where they announced the NatBank is the North American Development Bank created during NAFTA years. It's an infrastructure development institution that provides support on a lot of issues that are related to environmental advancement and environmental protection in the border. Water being one of their key aspects and, issues that they're stewards of the water, transboundary waters and whatnot. And they just recently announced a $400 million investment that was particularly dedicated for waters, and it's going to be allocated. And I think Tamaulipas was at the spearheading some of these investments in agricultural aspects. But when you think about this amount of money being, available for states to use on transboundary water issues, what would be things that you consider will be important to invest in for water in the next 5-10 years?
Definitely agriculture, but not just efficiency per se. We need to start defining the agriculture frontier, what we call it, because efficiency can be a trap. And we have seen that in other states. We've seen that in California. They are very efficient in the way they use the water. That doesn't mean that they are totally unsustainable. So it's not enough to be efficient. You also need to be sure that the water that is safe is used for the system, not to expand agricultural land, which has happened everywhere. And it happens everywhere too. And it's not just U.S. Mexico. That's what happens when you're very efficient. So it is important that we start conceptualizing what efficiency means in terms of agriculture. We need to start thinking in reducing allocations for both countries, not just one or just one state, it's all over. We need to start thinking, and the Lower Rio Grande is already thinking about it, reuse, because we're not reusing much on the Lower Rio Grande because we were used to have the water from the river, right? So now that we don't have enough water, what do we do? Okay, let's start reusing water. Let's start treating water. Let's start thinking about.
Apparently, we're also losing a lot, right? Like water needs, it's also a big waste of water. It's also
Exactly. In the state of Texas, just approved a $1 billion budget line just to replace water infrastructure, just to reduce the leakages at the urban scale. So every sector needs to adapt to whatever is available in the system, because the Rio Grande is in dire condition. all the way from headquarters to the Gulf of Mexico. It has lost 80% of its natural flow for the last 80 years or so. So there's not going to be more water for the current demand or the expected growth in the region. So there's going to be more pressure on groundwater. There's going to be more costly water for everyone, for every sector. There needs to be more efficiency, especially on the agricultural sector that consumes more than 80% of the water, but also the limitations of the agricultural land for both sides of the board. That's a big, big chunk. It puts limits. Nobody likes to put limits on the use of water. We're not used to that. Water is supposed to be a human right. And the application of the human right to water in Mexico hasn't really mean that. It means that you can use as much water as you can. And in state of Texas, you can use as much water as you can or pump as much water as you can. And that's in the Constitution. So we are kind of looking backwards into what we have done in terms of policy and governance structures and figure out how we can now move into something more sustainable. But that's going to be hard, especially for the current governance systems on both countries. And I always say that from my perspective, for Mexico, for me, it seems easier for Mexico to get in trouble with the U.S. for the 1944 treaty than actually make changes on the Constitution domestically to improve water governance to be able to comply more successfully with the treaty. So it's harder for Mexico to deal with internal water issues than to deal with the U.S. in terms of non-compliance with the treaty. That level is the sensitiveness of water governance systems on both sides. And the same here, and same in Texas. You're dealing with the Constitution, you're dealing with private property, you're dealing with what you used to do. You're dealing with water that you're supposed to have as much as you want for whatever you want, right? And if you don't have it when you open the tap, you're going to sue the government, right? Or the city or whatever. So water is not being allowed to be scarce for any sectors. And now that it's being scarce, now we are figuring out where the problem is. The problem is really on the policy and governance system that were built in the assumption that water is infinite, and it's not.
Let me jump in here and move on to our third segment of the podcast, talk about policy solutions. I think President Claudia Sheinbaum of Mexico on October 1st unveiled what she calls new legislation to deal with water. It'll be a new framework restricting concessions on water, presumably increasing the water management system, investing in such. It is a good solution, I think. Texas has also announced heavy investments in water infrastructure. It may be a little too late. It may be too few resources. Do you really think that Mexico is fiscally in a position to really begin to enforce a different framework for water management? And does it have the money for a new water infrastructure that is required to store, recycle, reuse, reduce, efficientize the use? This will probably require hundreds of billions of dollars on both sides of the border. Are we there? Can we really, as a policy option, is that feasible?
No, it's not. It's not feasible. Not right now. Think about it this way. Mexico has a delay of about 50 years of adaptation to current needs. So we're not there in terms of finding. It will need a big, big cost, not just economical cost, but political cost. And I don't think the current administration is willing to face that cost. And that's why I say this. They prefer the conflict with the U.S. than the conflict with Mexico in terms of the amount or the degree of the changes that would need to be on a position to negotiate something in better terms in terms of water allocation on the Rio Grande Basin. So that's why the option that I see left is to use extraordinary drought provision and delay the deficit, which is not going to be easy. I don't think it's going to be acceptable for Texas or the U.S. I don't know what is going to be negotiated. I read a couple of days ago that the Chamber of Commerce were asking to include water as a prerequisite, right? Whenever you comply with the water treaty, then we will comply with the commerce treaty between two countries, which it's an additional pressure to Mexico. It's not just tariffs anymore. It's any agreement now at any level that you're putting the water element there. That doesn't help water. I mean, that doesn't help the treaty at all. That doesn't help the system. That's not going to give us more water. That will put pressure into the Mexico side to take the problem seriously. And that's what I mentioned that from the beginning. I don't think Mexico has taken this seriously. I don't think this problem is in the national agenda of current President Sheinbaum. I don't think it is. I don't think the water isn't by national agenda. I don't think the water isn't even in the national agenda, even though the new regulation, I think is very limited. They're picking some things out of here, without getting into the middle of the monster, right? Because now it's becoming a monster that we cannot change from one day to day two. So they're just doing some kind of, for me, political actions, programs, initiatives that look good for political purposes, but not really to solve the water crisis. Not at all. And we see less investment for Conagua, for the environment every year. The budgets that they just approved, it's just less and less. Over the last 12 years, it's just been less investment. So they may be changing the law, but that is not going to solve the water crisis. And they are thinking about regulating concessions based on the data from Conagua. But we all know that those numbers on that data doesn't really represent what is going on in the field. So it's water and people. When they say that they have rescued, I don't know how much water they are allocating. I don't know how much water rights they have recovered from concessions. Those numbers may be not even real or representative of the real conditions of the system are. So I don't really personally trust.
The proposed legislation to overhaul the water system in Mexico may be more form than substance, more about trying to raise the price of water, reduce the number of concessions, but that's also going to put pressure on economic growth, which we know that Mexico is in really dire need of, and that means water. And so it just may be performative rather than substantive investment in water retention, storage, reuse, and recycling, because I think that's at the end of the day that the solution. So I think in terms of policy, the options appear to be somewhat limited. And if we don't change the framework in Texas and in the United States, in particular in Texas as well, of this idea that water it's a human right and should be, or at least a right, and should be available, then nothing really changes. And this only promises additional stress and, what we talked about in the beginning, additional conflict over who has the right to access what water, how much, and when in the future.
Yes, I think the current administration are just delaying. That's what the administrations of the last 25 years have been doing, just delaying the problem to the next administration and doing the least possible that would impact politically the administration. That's the way I see it. It has not been taken seriously. So the options are slim, and not to mention less resources for education and research. The Rio Grande Basin has just started to be modeled 5 years ago. 5 years ago. You can imagine the level, the reliability of the data, the reliability of those models, the data that is being used and shared between the two countries, the decision-making process, how that is being informed to decide what are we going to do with how much water do we actually have in the system or will have in the system with climate change predictions, is nothing compared to what has been done in the Colorado River. They have a model that was developed since the 50s. And now that model is able to predict how much water will be stored in Hoover Dam for the next year. And from that prediction, then water allocations are, distributed. It's not perfect, of course, it's a model. But we don't have that on the Rio Grande. And since the 80% or 77% of the basin, of the lower basin, relies on the Mexico side, so we rely on Mexico for that too, in education, in research, in investment, in data and data sharing, and all those components in communication and trust between the we don't have any of that built. So that complicates not just the policy development and governance, but also the information that is used to inform those new policies that needs to be developed in order to protect first the system, because without the system we do not survive, and later the rest of the users. So it is really a break point in the history, not just for the treaty, but for the Rio Grande system itself.
You just said it, this could be an area of opportunity. I think the data is crucial. And of course, we don't want to base all these predictions on a purely sustainability and biophysical terms, because there are so many other issues like the social aspect, which you were saying, the environmental justice dimension and all these other issues. But yeah, the fairness, the equity, these are not entailed in the treaty. But I know you're also part of the Permanent Forum of Binational Waters. You guys are developing a dashboard as well. Water, just give us something interesting to hold on to.
That's support.
Some hope, right? So to move forward, because there's little efforts here and there that are kind of moving the needle. And I think we should hold on tightly to those because it's always important, right? Some of these could grow, some of these could be leveraged, lessons learned, whatever. One more thing quick before we let you go will be great to hear.
Okay. Yeah, we need to talk about hope. That's an hard one. Currently, I always thought, me personally, the chaos is also the best opportunity for innovation, for change, for structural change too. So I hope, and I trust that the basic will speak louder and louder every time in a way that it will force us to give the priority it deserves at binational scale. That's my only hope. And also the states, the locals, the communities that speak to each other more informally, not informal channels, but informally across scale. I think those are my areas of opportunity that I would explore, that I will hope for to have more success than our federal channels or formal channels, if you want to call it. I think those informalities are much more successful, tend to be more realistic, and tend to represent more the localities and the communities of our border region than the formal macro channels. So I think there's hope because I've seen it. I've seen it how these communities talk to each other. And I think we're going to go down. We're going to go down to that scale, the downscaling the problem, and start from the locals and then, bottom-up approach instead of up-or-down approach, because that definitely has not helped. And those are the lessons learned from the Colorado River, by the way. That's how Minute 323, 330 got signed, because there was so much pressure from the civil society. It was not the federal government. It wasn't even the state government. It was the civil society, the NGOs, the communities, the cities, the ejidos, the farmers from both sides that get together and say, we need to do something because this is unsustainable. And it raised up the need. And then, it was easier for the formal channels to comply when there's such an important pressure. We need to build that on the vehicle.
This has been Baker Briefing, where we make news make sense. The podcast is brought to you by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, which delivers nonpartisan policy research on the most pressing issues facing the U.S., Texas, and the world. You can read more about water sharing and the issues facing Mexico in the binational relationship in 2026 at bakerinstitute.org/MCO. This episode was produced by Karina Zimmel with support from Shannon Moriarty. AV production was led by Kevin Young. You can check out our other podcasts and keep up with our latest research and events at bakerinstitute.org. Thanks for joining us.